Hello class, welcome back. So today we're going to start culture, which is chapter 2, which means you're done with chapter 1, which is the most challenging and difficult of the chapters. And we get to start talking about the fun stuff according to a lot of the students. So today we're going to talk about culture and start with the definition of culture. So what is culture? Now the book, starting in chapter 2 on page 40, it gives you a definition of culture as a shared beliefs, language, values, norms, behaviors, and even material objects. What you should know is culture is shared, it's learned, and it's taken for granted. It's everything around us. And something that we pass from one generation to the next. We socialize ourselves and others into what culture is. So let me give you an example from my personal life that I like to talk about in terms of explaining what is culture and how is it taken for granted. I have two sons, and one is 16 and the other one's 23. But about 10 years ago, maybe more, my youngest son was a little boy, 5, 6 years old, and he had a best friend. And we lived in Texas at the time. And they were always together, these two boys. So I either had both of them or his best friend's mom had my son and her son. So one day I'm in the carniceria, so the Mexican meat market, the Mexican grocery store. And my son's friend had never been to a Mexican grocery store. So I was explaining to him, like, it's an open-aired meat facility, so that's why you could smell the meat. And there's different products, and there's different products that we use for creating Mexican food, and that you could pick out a Mexican candy. And I was explaining these things, and I said to the little boy, this is, our culture. And to which my son replied, this isn't our culture, this is the grocery store. And the reason why I tell this is because when we think about culture, we think about usually other people's culture. We often think about food or material objects. What we don't think about is our neighborhood Albertsons or Ralph's, which is very much American culture. It's a good representation. You don't think about it as culture, but if you visit a grocery store in Italy or in another country, you're not going to find these giant grocery stores with neon lighting. You might, but you might find something very different. And so everything around us, our behaviors, the fact that we, how far apart we stand when we talk to each other, the fact that we stand in lines, the clothes that we wear, everything that we do is part of our culture. It's very much shared. It's learned, not only directly, but indirectly as well. And it's taken for granted, and that's why I use that example. When we talk about something like cultural relativism, what we're saying is we're trying to understand a culture on its own terms, instead of what we call ethnocentrism, which is trying to understand someone else's culture from our perspective or our terms. So we judge someone else's culture by our own. I see a misspelling, a little typo here I'll just fix. I don't like it. There we go. You talk about cultural relativism. It's trying to understand someone else's culture on its own terms from that culture's perspective. Ethnocentrism is judging another group or culture from your culture's perspective. The book shows a pretty good example of two women who were looking at, it looks like a picture of a movie star in a very scantily clad little outfit, but they're wearing a full robe and headgear and they're completely covered. So they're trying to understand this other girl's dress from the perspective of their culture, which is ethnocentrism. That doesn't necessarily mean ethnocentrism centrism is bad. It has both positive and negative consequences or attributes. Non-material culture are things that we would call parts of our culture that don't have actual physical objects attached to it, like food and clothing. So norms, values, and mores, language, and behavior are all non-material culture. The way that we speak, the way that we behave, talking with your hands, that's non-material culture. Speaking, the way that you speak about something. In Hebrew, there's only one word for jam or jelly, whereas in English there is jam and jelly. And we look at it as two actual different products. But in Hebrew, since there's only one word for both, it's really the same thing. And the way that you talk about it shapes the way that you understand that product or the world around you. So let's talk a little bit about norms, values, and mores. So norms are rules of behavior and abstract standards and expectations. So the way that I like to think about norms is the everyday rules of behavior. So some of the things that we do on an everyday basis that we don't think about as a rule or a guideline for how we're supposed to behave. If you were in a public restaurant and someone else's food looks really good to you, one of the rules of behavior, an abstract standard in our society, is that you're not allowed to eat the food of somebody you don't know. So if you're in a restaurant and somebody has these great looking French fries, you can't just go and sit and take one. That would be breaking a rule. Now, is it against the law? Not necessarily, and it's not necessarily an immoral act. It's just a norm, right? So a rule for how you're supposed to act. So think about a public restroom. What are some of the rules for a public restroom? What are you supposed to do and not do in a public restroom? Did anybody teach you those rules? Do you know how you learn them? You know them, but they're not necessarily strictly defined rules, and occasionally people do break them. A value, on the other hand, is more of an abstract standard of society. So it's a little more crucial and widely held than a norm. A value would be things like don't lie, don't cheat on your test, don't steal. So be honest is a value in our society. Work hard, play by the rules. Those are values that we have in our society. Now, sometimes a value has a law attached to it, but it's less likely to have a law attached to it. Values are usually rules that we have that you would receive a punishment for, but it's not necessarily enacted into law. So don't lie. For the most part, you're not going to get arrested if you lie, but we know that you might have negative sanctions from your classmates, your friends, your family, your parents, if you lie, because it's an abstract standard we hold for our society. On the other hand, a more is a stronger standard that we hold for our society. It controls our moral and ethical behavior, and this one is actually more often to be found to be upheld by the law. So a more would be like, don't commit murder, don't steal somebody's vehicle. These are more widely held values in our society. It's more important that you adhere to mores than it is to values, and therefore they're enacted into law. So don't steal somebody's car, don't take their identity and take their money, that kind of thing would be a more. Material culture is a lot easier to understand than non-material culture. This is what you think of when you think of culture: clothing, food, buildings, art, any objects created by society. Now, if we go back and look at some of the things, some of the pictures I posted, you probably would recognize, like this picture, as a food truck. And this is becoming very much part of our LA culture. right? A girl's tattoos, the back of her legs or arms, I'm not sure which, I think these are her arms. And the tattoo culture is becoming fairly pervasive, right? So this is the art in our society. These are the everyday objects, and we start to recognize the buildings and the food and the art and that kind of thing. That's material objects. Language is important because it shapes our thoughts and perceptions of the world. Now, I already gave you the example of the jam and the jelly, right? If you only have one word for jam and jelly, you're not going to see it the same as if you have two different words. That's what we call Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. The idea of love in the United States, we use the word love when we talk about how we love our girlfriend or our boyfriend, our husband or our wife, when we talk about how we love our puppy, when we talk about how we love our grandma. But we all know that the way we love our grandma is not the same way we love our boyfriend or girlfriend. It's not the same way we love our puppy. So it is something that is interesting for our culture that we only have one word for this concept, this abstract concept that can have a variety of layers and understanding to it. In some other languages, there's a number of different ways in which you can say love depending on what kind of love you're talking about. And this language, it becomes the way that we are able to share our experiences about the world, share our past and our future. It's a shared perspective. And for the most part, language gives us an insight into how a culture or a society thinks and understands the world around it. So for the most part, we tend to be directional or goal-directed linear thinkers. A lot of our ideologies about the world and the way it works around us are connected to this idea of being directional or goal-directed linear thinkers. So I'm going to cut off right here. I would like you, let's see. Yes. So I'm going to cut this one off right here, and then the next time when we come back, we're going to look at a short video on how to understand this idea of linear thinking, or how we can, further understand this idea of linear thinking in our own culture, in our own society.